All right, now jumping into the class, typically when people are considering joining a church, you basically meet up and that church talks about what we believe. And if you believe those same things, then you say, okay, we're on the same page, and you join the church. That's kind of how that works when it comes to joining a church. And that's historically what I've always done. But then about 4 years ago, I really jumped feet first into apologetics. Apologetics is just a fancy word for to defend. And it is defending our faith. And it kind of dawned on me that whereas joining a church can be about saying what we believe, really remaining in the faith. When you see young people or even old people fall away from the faith, I don't mean fall away from the church, I mean fall away from the faith, it's because they're unable to defend what they believe. They don't know why they believe. And I thought, you know what, let's go at this a different way. When people are considering joining the church, let's talk about why we believe instead. Now, that's not to say we're not going to end up with what we believe. We are. Like, take these things here. Typically, when you take a class, like this is what we would do with our confirmation students. We teach them that the Bible is the Word of God, the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the sacraments. I believe all these things. I believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, without error. I believe that everything the Apostles' Creed says. I believe the Ten Commandments, they're not man's idea. They're God's wisdom given to Moses on Mount Sinai in a real historical event. I believe the Lord's Prayer are words that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, and they were written down in Greek, and they've come to us 2,000 years later as the very words that God says when you pray, pray this way. I believe that baptism brings the forgiveness of sins. I believe that it's a miracle. I believe that Jesus' body and blood is truly present in, with, and under the bread and the wine of Holy Communion. I believe all of these things, but the question is, why? I'm going to tell you this, it's not because I've got some super strong faith. See, that's a tendency, that's a big mistake that we make with Christianity, that all Christians have got this super strong faith, and that's why they can believe these things, and some other people don't have as strong as faith, and that's why they can't. I need you to eliminate that idea right now. Everything I just said, I believe. And it isn't because I'm a pastor. It's not because I've got a strong faith. It's not because, I really hold on as tight as I can. It is simply because I believe this. Jesus rose again from the dead. Everything starts with the resurrection of Jesus Christ and that historical fact. Everything. And from there we do building blocks. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, the history behind the resurrection. And once we get to that particular building block, then we're going to see that Jesus' ascent into heaven is not going away, it's going to a different place, being at the right hand of God, which means that Jesus is God. And that's what we talk about. Now, if Jesus is God, then that means God exists. And if God exists, the question is, how has he revealed himself to us? He's revealed himself to us in the Bible, and he's revealed himself to us in the evidence of creation. Notice that we will meet 4 times before we even talk about the Bible. See, and that's not because we don't value the Bible. We do. But my point is this. I don't believe that Jesus is risen because the Bible told me so, and the Bible is true. I believe the Bible is true because Jesus is risen. That's the foundation upon everything else is built. And that's what we want to talk about here tonight. Okay, so let's talk about the resurrection as a historical event, and I'm going to use 3 texts that one I highly recommend, one I kind of recommend, and the other I don't recommend, and I'll tell you why. This is the main text that I use for apologetics. Josh McDowell, New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I do recommend it if you're really, really into this stuff. I don't recommend it if you have young kids. Spend time with your kids, okay? That's more important than learning this stuff right here. Because this is very detailed, but it's a great kind of detailed way to dive into not just resurrection apologetics, but all sorts of apologetics. The second book that I'll refer to is written by a guy named Gary Habermas. I just discovered him a couple years ago. Now this one I recommend because it's relatively easy reading, and it's very good. And Habermas is a local guy. He was born in Warren, grew up here in Michigan. He did go to Michigan State, but we can forgive him for that because he does such a good job with resurrection apologetics. So I'll refer to this book as well. And then the book I do recommend, so much so that I'm going to give you a free one, is this one right here. His name is Tom Zelt. He's a Lutheran pastor serving out in California. He leads a lot of tours to the Holy Land, and just resurrection apologetics is his specialty. And you can tell from it's not a hard read. It is very kind of straightforward. It's relatively simple, and I highly recommend it, so much so that I have one for each family, okay, that you can get on your way out. If you already have one, that's great, but just one for each family. I think I've got enough for all the families that are represented here. And I'm going to explain something that is inside of each of these that we made and we want you to have as well. So those are the three kind of references that all of my information is coming from, and I'll present to you. Let's begin with Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell is one of the leading apologists here in America, Christian apologist, and has been really since the 70s and the 80s. And pretty much that right there, what you're seeing, is the culmination of his life's work. And I used to think that Josh McDowell read a lot of books. Now I believe that he has read all of the books, like all of them. It's just amazing how many authors he will reference, so much so that that's what I love about that book. I have discovered 4 or 5 different, that's how I found Habermas, 3 or 4 other theologians, apologists, guys that I've referenced the last 2 weeks in sermons, Charles Edwards Jefferson, Griffith Thomas. These are old guys who were theologians back in the early 1900s, and they're fantastic. Their books are fantastic. And I found them basically because they were quoted by McDowell. McDowell writes this. He says, oops, let's see, I think I did all those. And yeah, so here's his approach, or here's his start. Josh McDowell says, after 700 hours of studying this subject and thoroughly investigating its foundation, I have come to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever foisted upon minds of men, or it is the most fantastic fact of history. The key word there is history. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is not some mythical event that you've got to have some super strong faith to hold on to. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is an event that happened in history, and that event was then passed down to us. Note how many times history is kind of in McDowell's approach. The resurrection of Jesus Christ and Christianity stand or fall together. A student at the University of Uruguay once said to me, Professor McDowell, why can't you refute Christianity? And I answered, for a very simple reason. I am not able to explain away an event in history, the resurrection of Jesus. I like this quote too. Now this is another example of what McDowell does. He finds, Wilbur Smith. I'd never heard of Wilbur Smith. Why? Because the book that he wrote was published in 1945. My dad was born in 1945. That's Pastor Terry was born in 1945, not me. But look how awesome this quote is. The meaning of the resurrection, that is a theological matter, the meaning of it. But the fact of the resurrection is a historical matter. The nature of the resurrection of Jesus may be a mystery, but the fact that the body disappeared from the tomb is a matter to be decided upon historical evidence. Now stop and think about that for a second. We tend to, and when I say we, critics or people who deny the resurrection maybe have a hard time with it, will dismiss it simply because it's a mystery. Yes, people don't rise again from the dead per usual. That's not a normal occurrence. And how it happened, that's beyond our understanding. It is a mystery. But just because something is hard to understand doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Those two, the logic just isn't there, okay? I don't know how Michigan lost to TCU in last year's college football playoff. That's hard to understand, but it happened. I saw it. It was the same thing with Jesus' resurrection. Simply because we can't understand it, that doesn't mean that you can just dismiss it. It was presented and given to us. It comes to us today, even 2,000 years later, as a historical event, a fact that happened, and the disciples were the first. But for the disciples' testimony to survive until today, it first had to survive the first 50, 60, and 75 years. And that's something that we tend to forget. And who do we have to thank for that? The church fathers. We've got Ignatius. Look at the dates. Now remember that Jesus rose in roughly 30 AD. The first Gospels are not written until about 50 to 55 AD. That means for 25 years, Christianity survived not because there's a book written. They didn't have a manual, right? They did not have a pamphlet to hand out. The Gospels are in the process of being written, but for the first generation, Christianity survives because of the resurrection. Now, from Ignatius, we can make our way into Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr, we will work our way into Tertullian. Notice how these dates. How is the resurrection event passed down from one generation to the next? It's not passed down. It's, guys, you really got to believe this. Guys, in order for us to honor the memory of Jesus, we're going to say that he's risen. Or we're going to say that his teachings are still alive, and then maybe it gets misinterpreted as he is still alive. That's what critics will say. Here's the problem. That's not how this fact was passed down from an early time frame. It's passed down as something that happened, not a doctrine that you have to believe in, but simply a fact that you need to know what happened. And then we have witnesses to it. Let's look at Ignatius. He's a key person in this, and McDowell says. And we have his writings. Jesus, he was crucified, died under Pontius Pilate. He really, and not merely in appearance, was crucified and died. He also rose again in 3 days. He was baptized by John, really and not in appearance. And when he had preached the gospel 3 years and done signs and wonders, he who himself was the judge was judged by the Jews, falsely so called, and by Pilate the governor was scourged, was smitten on the cheek, was spit upon. He wore a crown of thorns and a purple robe. He was condemned. He was crucified in reality and not in appearance, not in imagination, not in deceit. He really died and was buried and rose from the dead. This is presented to us as facts. Note his time, 50 to 115. Let's just conservatively say that he wrote this when he was, let's say, 60 or 50 or so. So that's going to put him around 100 AD, roughly 60 to 70 years after the events. Guys, when you stand up and say, this is what happened, and you're only 60 or 70 years away from the events, if you're lying and you have enough critics out there who don't want to, whatever you're saying, they don't want that to be true, and if you really are lying, guess what's going to come out? The truth. You can't lie about something that quickly after it happened. I know that 60 and 70 years sounds like a long time, but in the testimony of historical events, it really isn't. It is a super, super short time. Do you believe that the Roman Empire existed? Do you believe there was such a place as the Roman Empire? Yeah. Do you believe that there were Caesars, like Julius Caesar, Nero, Claudius, and those guys? Okay. The resources that we have, by the same historical markers that we have, that tell us these 4 facts, which we're going to talk about, that Jesus was crucified, his disciples believed that he rose again and proclaimed it, Saul was converted, and Jesus' brother James was converted. Those 4 things can be attested to as facts from history with more authority and certainty than the existence of every single Roman Caesar and the Roman Empire itself. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is a historical event that has perhaps more solid evidence than any other historical event, including the ones that we just take for granted. The whatever wars of Rome or what, crossing the Rubicon. There's a phrase that is in our English language because of what Caesar did. Okay, well, the historical event of Jesus' resurrection has more evidence than, let's say, Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, which any history person is not going to doubt. All right, questions up to through that point with McDowell. All right.
Aren't there
yes.
people who we would have considered detractors also recognize Jesus' existence and the missing body? They may not agree that happened, but
That's
Some of
Joe.
it's distractors.
Joe, that's one of my favorite stories, and you'll read about it here in Lynchpin because Tom Self mentions it. Is that how the enemies, in a backhanded way, kind of give evidence of Jesus' resurrection? 500 years. No, not 500 years. Not 250 years. You saw, remember the name up there, Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr, the church father, he lived around 250 A.D. He writes, kind of in his writings, that 250 years after the resurrection, the Jewish leaders, because Judaism still existed, obviously, it exists today, the Jewish leaders were still sending emissaries out to the entire Mediterranean world, trying to convince them that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and proclaimed it to be risen. Now, what does that prove? The tomb is empty, right? They're not saying we found the body. What it proves is the tomb is empty, and that's their explanation, and that they have not found the body. So in a backhanded way, his detractors even, and his enemies, kind of help to prove that, and Lynch has a whole chapter on that. I'm sorry, Zelt has a whole chapter on that in there. So, all right, let's talk about Gary Habermas. He takes a very interesting approach, and what he calls it is the 4 minimal facts. Habermas's story is great because at Michigan State, he was getting his doctorate, and this is 1976, and he goes into his advisors and says, I want to write a case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that's the name of his book. His book is basically his dissertation. This is his life's work, really. I want to write that, and his advisor said, fine, you can do it if and only if you cannot make a single reference to the Bible. You cannot say the Bible says so. You cannot use the Bible as a historical source, even though the Bible is a historical source, and people agree that Saul of Tarsus really existed. The existence of Saul of Tarsus, who then changed his name to Paul, is a historical thing that, again, has more evidence than the existence of all the Roman Caesars put together with the sheer volume of writing. Habermas said, fine, that's what I wanted to do, that's what I'm going to do. And so he has what we call the minimal facts approach. And the minimal facts approach considers only the data that meet these 2 criteria. They're strongly evidenced, and this data is granted by virtually all scholars on the subject, even the skeptical ones. And what that means is, as I said before, that same measuring stick that you apply to any other event in ancient history, if you apply it to the resurrection, what happens? When that happens, Habermas has come up with what he calls the 4 minimal facts. He doesn't include the empty tomb as one, so he kind of tacks it on there. That's why he calls it 5 facts, 4 plus 1. And what we have for you, my awesome assistant Jessica helped me put this together. Those of you who know Jessica, all right, our receptionist here, all right. Jessica is right in between my daughter's age. My 2 daughters. One is Leah and Becca. And so Jess is right in there in that age. So I feel like I've got my daughter working here with me. It's fantastic. Jess, she's the best. All right, and the Hebner's neighbor, right? Is she your neighbor, right? She doesn't. Has she quit egging your house, or is she still doing it? She hasn't quit. Right, okay.
She quit that.
She's fine. Yeah. She graduated at TP in the house. Yeah. So we put this together in a bookmark. Right? We bookmarked it up, and we've got a quote which I'll share with you. And so you'll find it in this Lynchpin book, and it's the 4 minimal facts. And kind of my goal is, like, for example, when I say 10 commandments, you guys all know what I'm talking about, right? You're like, well, yeah, duh, 10 commandments. When I say my goal is before God calls me home, I want for at least the people who are here at CTK, graduated from CTK, right, at school, when I say 4 minimal facts, they're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. Oh, yeah. Pastor Jay won't shut up about them, right? That's my goal. All right, PJ, I don't know if that's going to be your goal too, but help me. All right. Anyway, 4 minimal facts. We have presented evidence for Jesus' resurrection using a minimal facts approach, which considers only those data that are so strongly attested historically that even the majority of non-believing scholars accept them as facts. We have not appealed to or even suggested the inspiration or inerrancy of the Bible in order to support our case. Therefore, one cannot object to Jesus' resurrection simply because he or she rejects that the Bible is divinely inspired. Now, that's why I think this approach is so timely, and what fascinates me about it is because, unfortunately, we live in a world today where the Bible is immediately dismissed as not authoritative. You cannot say with many skeptics in today's world, well, the Bible says so, therefore it must be true. You just can't start with the absolute truth. And trust me, that's how kind of adult education in Christianity and began. Basically, I would stand up here today, let's talk about the existence of God. And I would have 5 verses that come from the Bible and say, boom, 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 boom. See, read those verses, that means God exists. And let's talk about, creation. Or let's, right here, boom, 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 boom. Let's talk about Jesus' divinity. And I would have 6 verses that say boom, 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 boom. All right, well, you have to believe it. The Bible says so. Guys, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news. It doesn't work that way anymore. It's the condition of the world that we live in. And so PJ and I, our goal as we're thinking ahead in the future is to help our young people with that, to give them a background, to give them something that they can fall back on when people say, well, the Bible isn't true, the Bible's just a bunch of lies. So to give them a real kind of handle on, to not immediately back down, so that when they can kind of start to gain some confidence, even here in junior high and the younger grades, so that when they go into high school and they're facing that teacher who kind of has something against, a little hostile to folks of faith because of that they've got something to fall back on. I don't want to say ammunition, because the last thing we need is another smart aleck 14-year-old. But they need to be able to defend what they believe. And when they say, well, the Bible is just a bunch of made-up lies, so they can say something to the effect of, actually, my faith in Jesus and my Christianity really doesn't have anything to do with whether the Bible is true or not. It has to do with the resurrection and that being true. Because you see where we're going to end up with. Once you establish the resurrection as a historical fact, and you simply follow everything through, where do you end up? The Bible is absolute truth. Okay? So, and we believe that is inerrant and divinely inspired. He goes on to say, so using our minimal facts approach, so for the sake of time, let's jump ahead here a little bit. Okay. We'll get to the 4 facts in a second. He makes this point here, is that a skeptic, that is somebody who disagrees with the resurrection, ought not to be allowed to simply cite apparent contradictions in the Bible and say that the resurrection has been disproved. The minimal facts approach builds a case using facts with a high degree of certainty, facts that any skeptic probably has. And as I said before, our goal is for these to kind of just fall off of your brain, just come out right away. Okay. Jesus is crucified by Rome and is killed. That is a fact that is established in history. 100% of historians agree with that. 100%. There was a movement in the 70s and 80s that maybe Jesus of Nazareth was a made-up person. There's been so much scholarship, so much archaeology, so much research done. McDowell makes the point that anybody who denies the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, they're really dismissed from the room as you're not a scholar anymore. You can go, and talk to the people who believe in leprechauns and unicorns, because to deny the existence of Jesus, you automatically disqualify yourself as a historical scholar. What can be proven from history, the same measuring stick by which we know everything about ancient history, is that his disciples believed he rose again. Now, why is that important? It's subtle. They believed that he rose again, and they proclaimed him as risen. They did not proclaim him as alive because of any other reason other than they saw him. They claimed to see the risen Christ. All right, that's very important. And they continued to do so. We have evidence of that in history. You have the conversion of Saul. Saul was a well-known Pharisee. His writings were well-known. The school in which he studied was well-known. And his conversion is significant. Something has to explain it. Something has to explain how you take the number one enemy of Christianity and all of a sudden he becomes its number one proponent. You have to ask the question, how does that happen? And Jesus' resurrection, as a historical fact, helps explain these things. It's not, again, this is not proof. And I think that's an important thing to realize. When you're talking about ancient events, you're not going to prove anything 100%. You can't prove that. Ancient events is about, is it more likely to have happened or less likely? And which interpretation explains the events that we have here. And that's Habermas's point. He does a great job of pointing that out in his book, kind of describing that in terms of the historical events. And 4, you have the similar thing, that's Jesus' half-brother James. This isn't James the apostle who was martyred in Acts chapter 12. Jesus' half-brother James. We have evidence, historical evidence, that Jesus' family members did not believe in him, or they didn't accept him. And now all of a sudden we have his half-brother, James, becomes one of the leaders in the church, and actually the leader in the church in Jerusalem. Something has to explain that. And I think this might be the quote that's on the back, is Habermas has shown more than 90% of New Testament scholars, from atheist to Christian, admit that tools such as these yield the following minimal facts, and we just had it there as well. I do want to have this one too. It's just the apostolic proclamation of the resurrection began very early when the church was in its infancy. And I cannot stress this enough. The heart of the resurrection as an event that happened in history is in the proximity of the original witnesses. It's simply too close, and it's an event that had too many enemies for it to be a lie that somehow slipped through. The way in which myths happen and grow is you need a significant amount of time to pass. I apologize now, but you're going to get a whole lot of sports examples whether you like them or not. That's simply the way that my mind works. I'm sorry. In 1984, you might remember a band of baseball players who were awesome. Awesome. We moved here in 1982. I grew up playing baseball, loved the sport, but I never had a hometown team. And when my dad became the senior pastor here way back when, 1982, I was 15 years old. Moved here, and I was so excited because I finally had a hometown team. And that was 82. In 83, we could not get over the hump that was the Baltimore Orioles. And then in 1984, you know what happened. 35-5, the Detroit Tigers could not be stopped. They were awesome. They won the World Series easily over the San Diego Padres, 4-1. The crowning moment being Kirk Gibson just hitting the upper deck shot against Goose Gossage. Yes, exactly. And rounding the bases like that. Okay, we can picture. I can close my eyes and I can picture. I can picture Sparky yelling at Gibson. Wasn't that awesome? He doesn't want to pitch to you. He doesn't want to pitch to you. It was awesome. All right, that's a historical fact that happened. Okay, that's 40 years ago now. 40 years ago. Okay, what if I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to change history. I'm going to start the lie that the San Diego Padres won the 1984 World Series, and they won it 4-1, and the crowning moment was Goose Gossage striking out Kirk Gibson for the final out. I'm going to start spreading that lie, and I'm going to wait a little bit. I'm going to wait 70 years until after it happens. So I'm going to wait until, 1984? What's 70 years? 2044? 2054? I'm going to wait in 2054. I'm going to start to spread that lie. How far does that lie go in the city of Detroit? It's 70 years. How far does it go? Nowhere. Because there's still people who can remember. Take the videotape out. Take the highlights out. Take ESPN out. Which, by the way, ESPN did get taken out. Right? Yes, I no longer get ESPN. I got Spectrum subscribe. I don't have, Joe, I don't have ESPN for the first time in my adult life. I'm beside myself. I don't know what to do. Anyway, take all of those things out. Guys, I can't spread that lie 70 years. There's too many people who saw it. The evidence is there. When you get that apostolic proclamation, we're not talking 70 years, folks. We're talking immediately. We're talking about it being proclaimed for 25 years, then it's written down. Guys, there's simply too many enemies of Jesus who, if it was a lie, they would have exposed the lie. I'm sorry. That's how history takes place. And that's why, again, I cannot stress this enough. I'm not asking you to have a ton of faith. I'm simply asking you to ask the question, is the witness credible? And if we think logically, where do we land? And I've stressed this, I've said this time and time again. Christianity is a thinking person's religion. The reason that I'm a Christian is because I like to think. I like to use my brain. I ask questions. I'm not satisfied with, well, that's just the way it's always been, or Jay, we just got to believe it, or we'll find out when we get there. No, I've never been like that. And so the reason why Christianity works for us thinking people is because it is designed by God, who is intelligent, for folks who are intelligent and like to put their brains in motion. Atheists, those who deny, well, they're actually not thinking. That's a great irony. The great irony is people think that Christians have a ton of faith, when in reality, it's the atheists who have all the faith, because they believe in something with zero evidence. With all the evidence is stacked against them, that's the great irony. All right, so let's go to Tom Zelt then. And again, don't forget your book, One Per Family. And if you want more than one, I think they're available in the bookstore. Again, I highly recommend it. I mean, you can read that in a sitting, for crying out loud. But this is great. His point is, with the linchpin, is that every movement has a beginning. And we have here, his example is that the linchpin is that pin that's stuck through the axle keeps the wheel on. Without it, the wheels literally fall off. The resurrection of Jesus is the linchpin to understanding God. If there were no resurrection, the wheels come off the wagon. All the talk about Jesus being God incarnate, forgiveness, the authority of Jesus, the importance of the Bible, and life after death are simply empty words. If there's no resurrection, there's no reason to believe in Jesus. And he also has this quote about the Bible itself. While the Bible certainly bears witness to the truth of Christ, people don't esteem the Bible. People who don't esteem the Bible will pass those words off as irrelevant to their lives because they simply don't believe the Bible. This can lead us back to the first testimony of faith. We believe in Jesus because he really did rise from the dead. Let's take a little deeper look at this movement. Zelt does a great job of introducing us to Roman historians, two of them, Tacitus and Suetonius. Tacitus was a senator and historian of the Roman Empire. He lived about 50 to 120 AD. Notice how this is about the same time as Ignatius. Very close to the time of Jesus. His writings examine the reigns of Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. Tiberius was the Caesar when Jesus was killed. Claudius is the Caesar when the Jews are expelled from Rome, roughly 50 AD. That is significant, as we'll see here in a moment. And of course, Nero is the Caesar who persecuted Christians and more than likely killed Paul and Peter, roughly 64 AD or around that time. Nero fastened the guilt. Now, this is what he wrote. Okay, this is Suetonius has this. Any historian is going to agree that this is a legitimate reporting of the information of ancient history. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians. This is when Rome burned. Nero took it out on the Christians. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of their procurators, Pontius Pilate. Again, Pontius Pilate, attested to by history outside the Bible. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out only in Judea. Now, scholars have rightfully assumed that he's referring to the resurrection. Isn't that a curious phrase for it? A most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, because that's what people were saying. And people were reporting that, and it could not be disproven. Notice how he says this was said, but we disproved it. He says we checked it. We kind of have it under control, but now it has seemed to be popping up again. So in this brief paragraph, Tacitus, a historian that nearly every legitimate ancient history scholar would agree, we learn this. Without even having the Bible, we know that there was a movement named for its founder called Christus. We know that, too, it began related to an execution carried out between 26 and 36. Tiberius reigned during that time, and Pilate was a procurator from 26 to 36. 3, the movement originated in Judea, and it spread all the way to Rome. And it's also clear that it started among the Jews. During the reign of Caesar Claudius, the Jews were expelled from Rome. Why? Because of the riots that erupted in the city. And we have that as a historical event. Luke refers to it as well in the Gospel of Acts. But again, this is an example where we don't believe it's true because the Bible is inerrant and thus it has to be true. We do take the book of Acts as history because so much of what has happened in Acts you can verify through Suetonius and Tacitus, which is very significant. Suetonius refers to a wave of riots which broke out in the large Jewish community. What caused the riots? He says the instigation of Christus. Now, the instigation of Christus makes no sense if Jesus is dead. It makes no sense if they found an empty tomb, but then all of a sudden they found the body. It just doesn't. If Suetonius too refers to the great fire during Nero's reign that he has there. I love this quote. If you knew nothing of the New Testament, if the New Testament didn't even exist, right? You never read the Bible, and you just were studying history of Christianity, and you just were tracking this down through the normal means of studying ancient history. The Bible doesn't even exist. You would know this. You would conclude that Christianity came from among the Jews. It began in Judea, started somewhere between 26 and 36 AD, was related to a new and mischievous belief regarding a Messiah. The movement around this messianic claim was powerful enough to have caused riots among the Jews. It was important enough that they risked being banished from their homes and businesses in Rome. It is obvious that this movement had a cause. What caused it? We have to ask that question. Whether or not we believe that the cause was the resurrection of Jesus, we see some event of such unmistakable significance that it caused a major movement to spread throughout the Roman Empire. And it was started by something big. And we believe that something big was the historical event of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Again, just because it's 2,000 years old doesn't mean it's any less true. I'm not asking you to believe the event because you have a lot of faith. I'm simply asking you to accept the witness as it has come to us through the various links in the chain, because there's not a weak link in that chain. If there was, it would have been exposed early on. Christianity doesn't make it out of the first century if Jesus isn't risen. So that's our starting point for Christianity. Questions, thoughts, comments? All right. Well, between now and then, take a book. All right. Begin to skim it. We'll come back to it a little bit next week. We'll have some follow-up on this because I do want to address briefly some of the critics and what they say about some explanations for the empty tomb that are sometimes offered, that are sometimes out there. Yes, Ann, I'm sorry.
Well, I think it's similar to a resurrection when someone dies, but it's not their turn to go yet, and they all have the same. They go through the tunnel.
Oh, right.
And they come back with this feeling that it's going
Right.
the heaven. And they all describe it the same way.
Yeah, some of those near-death experiences, yes.
Right.
And that's for example, one of the things that critics will say, well, Jesus had a near-death experience. And so we'll talk a little bit about to why that probably didn't happen. And it's more examples of how it really does. It takes more faith to believe that Jesus didn't rise again, frankly, than he did when we consider all the evidence that we talked about. So, all right, well, it's great to see you all and meet you. I look forward to getting together on Tuesdays. It's always funny. We get together this Tuesday after Labor Day, and today was a hot summer day, and then it just move into fall. The days get shorter and shorter and all that. So, but the good news is these cool evening temperatures make for a lot of dew and condensation on the lawn in the mornings. So that's a very good thing, as I've explained to my staff. It's a long story. We'll talk about it. All right. Thanks, everybody.